Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Surviving Scientology Radio with your host, Jeffrey Augustine. Today, we have on with us New York City Attorney Peter Crusco. Peter, welcome to the show.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much.
Peter, the reason I asked you to come on the show is you're working on a lawsuit. You filed a lawsuit on behalf of your client, Jonathon Carter, and we'll get to that. But this case came to my attention because one of the people involved is named Dan Ribacoff, who is a polygrapher, but he's also a private investigator. I came across him when he was working for the Church of Scientology, and one of his investigators sent out a text message while they were following Leah Remini and Jennifer Lopez in New York City. And this investigator, Yanti Mike Green, said, word is they want to kill her, meaning the church wanted to kill Leah Remini. So this led me to investigate who is Dan Ribacoff. And then this led me to your lawsuit. So before we get there, I want to ask you just a few questions. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, Peter?
Sure. I've been a practicing attorney for more than 40 years. I was the chief of investigations for the Queen's DA's office for 20 years, a prosecutor for close to 40 years, federal, state, and local. So with a specialty in investigations. And once I retired from law enforcement at the end of 2019, opened up my own practice where I do special cases for people who are in dire need of assistance. And this particular case came to me from an old friend in the New York State Police who thought Mr. Carter had been treated unfairly and knew me and knew my background. I'm a very persistent type of person. And I spoke to Mr. Carter, and I thought he definitely needed some help and was treated unfairly. He is a decorated New York City police officer working in the transit division who had applied for a job with the MTA, and having gone through 95% of the process, was about to start, except for a polygraph exam, which he took, and he was totally failed it. And once he sat down with me and went through everything, I thought this was a case ripe for looking into, scrutinizing, and took his case, and here we are today. So,
understood. And so polygraph examinations are used by a lot of law enforcement agencies, private employers, etc. And so really there's a polygraph exam at the heart of your case. That was what the New York Metropolitan Transit Authority used to deny your client, Jonathon Carter, a position.
Yes, and you know, polygraph exams are not admissible in court, but there is a federal law that allows them to be used by law enforcement agencies as a screening tool. But if that screening process is not done fairly and done according to the rules of the road, that process can be used as essentially a gatekeeper to keep certain people that they don't want there. And it appeared that, based upon the investigation that we conducted, that the polygraph exam in Mr. Carter's case was being used to keep him out. And after further investigation, we determined that there was some racial motivation with regard to this. We interviewed MTA former and present officers. We contacted the Guardians Association, a fraternal organization of Black and Hispanic officers who represent those individuals in the MTA Police Department. And we learned that the FOIL request that the MTA officers had, the Guardians had filed for the recruitment and hiring and promotion statistics had not been satisfied and had not been given to them in quite a long time. And in fact, the records of this were not available. So based upon all those investigative methodologies, we determined that there was circumstantial corroboration of Mr. Carter's claims, as well as how he was treated by the polygrapher herself. in that Mr. Carter also has a disability which was recognized by the MTA Medical Board, but when he went for the polygraph examination, the polygrapher scoffed at him and said that was not a disability. The disability is white coat syndrome, which has been, studied and held as a legitimate medical disability. The polygrapher scoffed at it and did not accept it, and went on to demean him at the test. So besides that, and the fact that the test procedures, we believe, were not conducted by what are standardized rules of the road to conduct a polygraph examination, we filed a complaint with the Equal Opportunity Commission in the New York office, which has been pending now for over 190 days, and we are asking them to take the case and to investigate and prosecute the MTA for racial discrimination. They have the choice whether or not to do that, or to give us what they call a right to sue letter. But we believe that this is a matter that the federal government should be pursuing. We are willing to do it ourselves if they choose not to, but we think, based upon all the evidence to date, especially what has been uncovered by and what has been stated by the New York Daily News, that this is a case ripe for review by the EEOC.
And this leads me to ask three questions. This is for the benefit of our listeners who may not be familiar with some of the terms. What is white coat syndrome? Could you please tell us what that is?
Well, white coat syndrome is essentially a medical condition that a person has, and it is easily medically tested when they usually go into a clinical environment, doctor's office and the like. Their blood pressure will raise, their biometrics will go off the chart, and since biometrics are used by the polygrapher to test a person's honesty and truthfulness, it's a situation where the test has to be some type of accommodation made to which under federal law is allowed for people with disabilities. And this is a legitimate disability, white coat syndrome, and it's in the annals of the medical literature. And in fact, the MTA Medical Board recognized that and gave Mr. Carter, my client, an accommodation when he went for his medical tests. So that in a nutshell is what white coat syndrome is.
Yes, I've experienced that. I go in for a checkup. I'm nervous about the medical exams. My blood pressure is high at the beginning. But once I relax down, realize I don't have a fatal disease, it's just a normal checkup, my blood pressure drops. I think people have gone through that. It's a very stressful situation.
Yes,
yeah.
And there are some people who that stressful situation, your biometrics go off the chart, and those are the people that have been diagnosed with white coat syndrome.
And so when you're doing a polygraph and one of the metrics is blood pressure, then it will throw off the polygraph test if the examiner does not adjust for it. Exactly.
And usually with respect to polygraph examinations, they're standardized questions when you first come in. They try to relax you, they try to calm you down so they can ask you the standard questions, which are the questions which they know that you will answer truthfully to, and which they have the answers to. Those test questions have to be asked in a sterile environment where the person's biometrics have been stabilized. If they're not, because the person has white coat syndrome and is experiencing the impact of white coat syndrome and there's been no accommodation made, you're going to not get an accurate reading.
Okay, that helps us to understand what it is. So there's a problem there. Secondarily, the firm, the MTA, contracted with a firm called In-Depth Polygraphs to conduct pre-employment screenings for candidates, correct?
That's correct.
and that firm is owned by Dan Ribacoff.
Correct.
And the test was performed by his daughter, Lisa Ribacoff.
That's correct. Our complaint with the EEOC specifies all those, factual allegations.
Now, Dan Ribacoff appears on NBCUniversal's The Steve Wilkos Show, where he's promoted as a celebrity polygrapher. So in addition to his regular in-depth polygraph company work, he appears on television.
Yes, I've heard about that.
Yeah. So at least he's well known to viewers of the Steve Wilkos Show. But at the heart of it, there was you discovered some disturbing information, allegations about Mr. Ribacoff.
Yes. Well, as I persisted in my investigation to determine whether or not there was any, circumstantial corroborative evidence for Mr. Carter, I learned that there had been several lawsuits out there, and I contacted the various law firms and requested, pursuant to Rule 35, the federal rules of procedure, what they call a litigation hold. In other words, hold any evidence that you may have which may be pertinent to an EEO future federal case. And part of my job as a prosecutor was learning about wiretaps and reviewing wiretap transcripts and reviewing the various electronic communications that people and companies involved in on a day-to-day basis, such as text messages and the like, which are kept by certain service providers. Some service providers don't keep them very long, others do, based upon the terms of service. So I was looking for any type of text message, electronic communications, which may substantiate Mr. Carter's claims. And, took months to get responses, and eventually it proved fruitful.
So these are specifically referring to the alleged racist text messages.
Correct. In response to a litigation hold letter, I received these records, and I forwarded them to the EEOC for their review in Mr. Carter's case.
And this was covered by the New York Daily News edition of November 12, 2021 by the reporters Clayton Goose and Noah Goldberg.
That's correct.
If our listeners want to read the specific details, it's certainly a compelling story. And in reviewing it, what stands out is the thoroughness of the legal work you did to develop this kind of evidence for your case.
No, thank you. I mean, I had great support. I have a great team, and we just not going to let the ball drop. Mr. Carter has been unfairly treated, as you can see in the Daily News reporting, and in the text, the alleged text, that they're very degrading. They're very degrading and prejudicial, biased, and racist. And they're definitely defamatory of Black people. And the concern when I first got them, when I first went through them, was how could someone who's got that much power over someone's career choices, have this mindset? And that was my concern. And then I realized it was a smoking gun, and that the EEOC should be apprised of it, and it should consider this in making their determination. Hopefully they consider this, and and Mr. Carter is able to get another lease on life and do what he wants to do, work that I think he, given his background and experience in the transit division of the NYPD, he would be a wonderful asset to the MTA. And that's another reason why, I pursued this case, because I just couldn't understand why they wouldn't want a person of his caliber and his experience.
Well, certainly, and when in reading the article by Mr. Goose and his colleague Mr. Goldberg, what stands out to me is if you had the polygrapher is the gatekeeper, and the accusations made in the article that there's a pattern of systemic racism in hiring at the MTA. Look, there's been in 2012 and 2015, the MTA had to settle, racial claims before, racial bias claims before. But if you have a gatekeeper who's allegedly a racist, then that's sort of a hidden secret, nod and a wink way to reinforce what would be called an old boys club,
Absolutely, and it's very difficult to prove, but especially when the statistics are not made public, and the request for a FOIL disclosure is not satisfied. But we've discussed and interviewed members on the job of the MTA Police Department and members who have retired, and they have said, based upon their own observations, that the number of recruits of black persuasion have decreased over the years, not increased, which again corroborates Mr. Carter's allegations in this matter, and is troubling because a diversified pool of police officers is obviously something that we all want, because then there's no question about the fairness of the police officer who may take specific action on the street. I mean, you try to make a diverse pool of candidates, a diverse department, so that everyone's represented, and that means that it's less likely to be discriminatory towards the citizens on the street.
Sure, and that's why, and I think for listeners outside of the United States, and even some listeners in the U.S., could you explain what the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, why it exists, why it was set up, and what it's supposed to do, and why that's the agency you're bringing your complaint to?
Yes, well, the EEOC was created years ago to be the gatekeeper on all discrimination matters, and federal law was passed, and that the EEOC would review complaints. They have that authority. There's various regions, and the law also requires them to review a matter for at least 180 days before a litigant could file a federal lawsuit, so that they're the place of first repose for anyone who believes that they've been discriminated in race, creed, color, sex, national origin, disability, and the like. And unfortunately, over the years, the number of cases that the EEOC actually prosecutes has decreased, to the extent that my last review appears that there's less than 1% of the cases that they handle do they actually take on to prosecute themselves in the name of the government, which means that the citizen, him or herself, who believes that they've been discriminated against, has to pay the fare themselves and has to prosecute it and obtain an attorney and somebody who's willing and able to fight for them. And these are usually costly and long drawn out battles, especially against major entities. The MTA is a multi-state agency. It has vast resources. The police department is at least, I believe, 800 officers. There are thousands of employees that work for the MTA. I believe there's over 50,000 employees that work for the MTA. And, they have a whole army of attorneys. And that's why the last time they were sued, I believe it took 7 years to resolve the case, and there the ACLU prosecuted the matter. So for one individual to prosecute one of these cases against the MTA, it is a great undertaking. And
that's an understatement, given the size of the bureaucracy. Now, to educate our listeners, I'm not a lawyer. You're a lawyer. I want to ask you a question. In the United States, is it true that you have to get the government's permission to sue the government?
Generally speaking, yes. That, in other words, there has to be a law, on the books that allows you to sue a government or the government official. Yes.
Now, this is interesting because there's a certain amount of immunity the government has. So
That's correct. But that is justified on the basis that certain government officials have to have what they call qualified immunity in order to do their jobs, because no one would take those jobs if there wasn't some type of qualified immunity. Now,
sure.
the EEO law is essentially an exception to that, which allows you to bring an action against the governmental agency because of a violation by that agency of the constitutional rights of the people involved who are litigating.
So you're getting, yeah, into some very sophisticated type of litigation. You have to know what you're doing.
Correct.
And I'm glad there are lawyers like you who will help the individual, take on a bureaucracy.
And there are also time frames. There are very short time limits applicable to suing government agencies. For instance, many people don't know this, but there's what they call a notice of claim. You have to file a notice of claim within 90 days of a wrong allegedly inflicted by a government agency. If you don't file that notice of claim, you will lose that right unless a judge gives it to you. And then there are specific rules for applying to a court to get an extension of that time. So, there are various, impediments that a civilian has to know about and could easily violate without knowing those that would impede their claim.
Certainly, when it's that technical, how would you know? How would a lay person like me know what my rights were, what my time limits were, what I had to do? Well, I would have to get a lawyer.
That's right, and those laws are different in every state. And you're licensed in every state. A lawyer has to be licensed in the particular state that he's giving advice in order to practice law in that state. So it's very fact specific, state specific, and they call these torts, and you have to be familiar with tort law and the different time limits that each particular wrong involves.
Yeah, and I think that your case with Jonathon Carter is very interesting because it has so many different angles to it. For example, as I stated at the beginning, I learned of it through Scientology, through a polygrapher working for the MTA who also was working for the Church of Scientology, spying on people. And
Yeah.
And then there's an underlying case where there's a claim that one of his PIs sexually assaulted a woman, swindled a client out of millions of dollars. And so when you get into investigating a lawsuit or something like Scientology, you never know where it's going to take you. You go down a rabbit hole, literally. Were you surprised in this case how much there is to it? Or is it for you, do you look at it simply as a lawyer, as your client, this case, the EEOC?
No, given my background, I had many years of dealing with organized crime entities that we would have to go through various meandering paths in order to identify who was involved and who was behind it. So, I anticipated that there would be various avenues here, but of course the text messages were something that no one could really anticipate. And you never know. Once you open a case and you start digging, you never know what you find. As I'm sure that's been your experience, in private investigations and alike, because people are people, and you never know really what's behind the the front that they put on, and what you find later on after you spent the time and effort in looking beyond it. Sometimes it's quite different than what you thought.
Oh, yeah. Sometimes when you get into a case, I'll give you a hypothetical example. I mean, this happens often enough. You get a client who insists that their business partner's embezzling from them, right? Embezzling from the company. So the business partner, she says, my partner has embezzled $5 million from the company. And I work a lot in white collar crime, money laundering, things like that. But what you wind up, you often, a lawyer, private investigator, you have to tell clients, we're going to go where the facts and the evidence lead.
Right.
And sometimes you wind up telling a client, look, I'm sorry, but your adult son who's 27 stole the money. It's not your business partner. And that the client's not expecting. What do you mean? That can't be true. You're lying. No, here's the evidence. And then they make a decision whether or not they want to prosecute or handle it privately as a family matter.
Sure.
So yeah, you never know where a case is going to take you. Now, working in organized crime, can you talk about any of your high profile cases? And what was, in general terms, that's a very,
I worked the whole gamut for many years, and from organized crime, auto crime, theft. I mean, there was a time at which the Gambino crime family controlled the auto theft trafficking in the New York City area, and that was big business, and it was very difficult to get witnesses to testify because they would be intimidated. Thankfully for the witness protection program on both the state and city and federal level, that helped a great amount. But I also did cases against churches. There was a church in Queens in which it was actually it was running a gambling operation. Greek organized crime was running the operation, but no one knew about it until some woman who had lost $5 on a bingo bet, complained about it to the state lottery commission, and a big investigation started, and we eventually were able to arrest the leaders of it, and it turned out that there was no real church running the bingo. It was just a big operation, gambling operation. So you never know where anything goes. And I also did narcotics trafficking cases with the Cali and Medellin cartels, and it really was quite a career I had. And I enjoyed it, and I learned a lot about human nature and the role of just being persistent and not giving up. And if there's smoke, there's probably fire somewhere, but you just have to keep on pressing on. And I learned today that in the daily news that the MTA was now limiting the polygraphs, and that's a big step forward. That the contract was essentially impacted, and it would never have gotten even that far, but for the fact that we pressed on, and we saw that there was something here, there was an injustice, and it had to be righted. And it's not over yet. We're still counting on the EEOC to prosecute the matter, but we will press on. We'll go forward, and your show today, we hope will help those efforts and help my client get justice.
Sure, absolutely. And I'm glad to help. I want justice for Jonathon Carter. When I read the case, it was very personal to me. I could relate, and I'll tell you why. I've been polygraphed several times in my life. And for example, when I graduated from university, I went to work at Hughes Aircraft Company back in the Cold War,
Okay.
and early 1980s. And I remember this was the first time I was polygraphed to get top secret clearances as a technical writer, correct? And
Right.
I remember going into the polygraph, as a young man, and these are older. I've got to go to the FBI does this, Department of Defense, and so I'm nervous right away. So I get hooked up. They put the band around your chest. They do all the things, and you're in this room. The doors are locked, and it's intimidating. And
Absolutely.
you're doing it under penalty of perjury. And so this is in the Cold War era. Okay, so they asked me these usual questions, and they have you ever taken anything you shouldn't have? They want to see, of course, people take things here and there, right?
Right.
But they want to establish. So I said yes. I told the truth. I've taken a few things I shouldn't have, like when I was a kid. Have you ever told a lie? Yes. Just things like that. Have you ever been out of the have you ever been out of the country? But then they start getting into some hard hitting questions. Back then, I remember them asking, are you a homosexual?
Right.
That was intimidating and invasive.
Sure.
And I answered no, but I was nervous, like, because back then that was a bad thing to be. It wasn't not like modern times. Back then it was illegal in some places to be homosexual, to be gay, or to express that. I remember the raids on gay bars. Stonewall. My late great uncle was one of the founders of the Mattachine Society. So for me, that was real. I kind of grew up around that. And that was just in our family, that was accepted. It was not a big deal. But then they also asked me, are you a communist?
Right.
No. Have you ever been to Moscow? No. Have you ever had any family that's been to Moscow or any parts of the Soviet Union? No. Have you ever stolen money? And, these things really impinged on me.
Sure.
Because I'm thinking I'm going to be a defense worker to serve my country.
Right.
And here I feel like they're interrogating me. So it was somewhat an experience, and I passed the polygraph. I got the job, right? Because I grew up in the Christian church. I was a squeaky clean church boy.
Right.
I really hadn't done anything, but nevertheless, it was very intimidating to go through that. And I could, and so what didn't make sense to me, I was a reserve police officer, very, very short time in my 20s, and I went through a polygraph for that because the state has monopoly on violence. So before they give you a gun and a badge, they want to make sure that I do the psychological profile, drug screen, polygraph, all that. And I was a little bit older then, and I knew what it was. So being polygraphed can be very intimidating. And then when I went to apply, I was worked in two major corporations in my career. I got polygraph, drug screen for that because I had fiduciary responsibility, I had all kinds of responsibilities in the corporation.
Right.
So when I read about Jonathon Carter, your client, he was already a member of the New York Police Department. He was an officer,
Right.
which meant he had already been through everything. He'd already been through a polygraph, drug screen, psychological profile. And so to me, it stood to reason that he should have been a shoe-in to just go in and repeat the same process and go on. Because if you're a cop and you've been through the process, you just repeat it and you go transfer to the MTA. And when he was denied on a polygraph, I thought, wait a minute. If he passed the first one, it should be easy to pass the second one because it's the same basic process. And then when you put your pieces together in your case, and I read up and I thought, okay, there's the hidden element there is the polygrapher. And also I have to tell you, Peter, that in the Church of Scientology, they do what are called sec checks, security checks.
Okay.
And these are like, are you lying about anything? And they want to know what sex acts you've committed, with whom, when, how many times. They have a famous what's called the Johannesburg sec check or the Joburg sec check. And I'll post it on the show notes for this show. They want to know, have you ever engaged in baby farms, meaning selling children trading illegal diamonds? Are you a communist? Do you have any evil thoughts or purposes about L. Ron Hubbard? So when I went in to do some initial Scientology, I got sec checked. And this is what's so interesting about the parallels here I'm going to make. Before the Church of Scientology takes anyone, you have to sign some contracts that strip you of your rights, and I've written about those extensively. But they also sec check you with an E-meter, which is a crude polygraph. It detects galvanic skin response.
Right.
It's only one channel, whereas a polygraph will use several channels, breath, voice, stress, blood pressure. So, but I remember when I got sec checked, I had security clearances, which can disqualify you to do services in the Church of Scientology or to be a member of the Church of Scientology. If you're law enforcement, intelligence, you've had security clearances, been a police officer, Scientology doesn't want you. That can disqualify you.
Really?
Yeah, they're paranoid. They don't want they don't want law enforcement types in the church. I mean, they have a few officers here and there, but they tend to distrust you. And so I remember when I was getting sec checked in the Church of Scientology, they asked me some very sophisticated questions. And having been through Hughes Aircraft as a defense worker and seeing U.S. intelligence and kind of gotten to work around a lot of people who had been in the military for 20 years and knew about intelligence, knew about different things who could tell me, and seeing the complexity of the U.S. defense establishment, gotten a little taste of it, right?
Right.
I remember a program I worked on got canceled because then Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger canceled it. And there were probably 10,000 people involved in this project called Roland. And I thought, my God, what power Cap Weinberger has that he can cancel a weapons program. It was astonishing. So my point is, when I was getting security checked by the Church of Scientology, I realized they were operating a very sophisticated intelligence organization within the church. And it was not like any church I grew up in. I grew up in the Christian church, where if you came to our church, we would give you a free Bible, we would feed you, we'd invite you, to Bible study, to church, right?
Right.
We wouldn't sec check you to find out if one of the questions, have you been sent in? Are you a member of law enforcement? Have you been sent in to infiltrate this organization? No. It was quite something. So on a very visceral personal level, I could relate to Jonathon Carter.
I can imagine. Yeah, I can imagine based on that experience, certainly.
Well, that's why I think anyone who's ever been through a polygraph in any kind of employment can relate to your client. And then he gets failed on a polygraph, and then we find out the alleged nature and character of the polygrapher. Well, there's a motive to disqualify him. And so I want to see justice in this case. The EEOC should do the right thing and take on the case. And I salute you for helping Jonathon Carter get through this, because it is a sophisticated roadmap you need an expert lawyer to do. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your time and the opportunity to tell people what's going on.
Oh, you're welcome, Peter. And we're going to stay in good touch as the case develops, because we want to see what happens. So I look forward to another interview as things develop. And thank you for being on the show again. And for everyone out there listening, this has been Jeffrey Augustine on Surviving Scientology Radio with New York City attorney Peter Crusco. And as always, we'll be in very good touch. Thank you.